Hi, this is Grant with Fight for Forensics, and today we're going to be talking about cross-examination, or CX. Now, while it can be easy to tell the difference between a really good cross-examination and a really bad cross-examination, a good cross-examination features a lot of different factors that come into play. So what that means is our lesson for today isn't going to be as organized or straightforward as others might be. Rather, I'm just going to be talking about some different things that are important to a good cross-examination. If you focus on these, I do think your cross-examination will get better. However, cross-ex is the type of thing that just gets better over time and with practice. You can't just sit down and then figure it out one day. First, I just want to talk about why cross-examination matters, because understanding how it's useful might really help us to develop a good strategy. One important factor of cross-examination is that it gives the judge a direct comparison between the two debaters. And it's really the only time that the judge has this. As in all other speeches, you may be responding to your opponent, but it's not an explicit back and forth like it is in cross-examination. And many new judges who don't have a very strong grasp of Lincoln-Douglas debate will heavily rely on cross-examination to determine who wins the round, as it can certainly establish an atmosphere for who's dominating who. Next, and this is something that's incredibly important strategically, cross-examination lets you set up arguments that you're going to use later in the round. Before you begin your cross-examination, you should have a rough idea for what your strategy for the rest of the round is going to be. Consequently, you should try to see if you can get some of those big arguments out during cross-examination. Now, we'll talk about how to do this in a little bit, but the important thing to realize is that if your opponent agrees to something during cross-examination, they can't later disagree with that, and that's something that you have to use to your advantage. So with that in mind, let's just go over some miscellaneous good things for cross-examination. So as I stated, before cross-examination, you should have a rough idea for what your strategy for the round is going to be. You should know what arguments you're going to be making and what you have to do in order to win them, and how that's going to win you the round as a whole. So one tip here is that I think you should set up your justifications for your arguments within that cross-examination period. Now, I do want to be clear that you shouldn't just ask your opponent if they agree with your conclusion. That's never going to happen, and your opponent's always going to say no, it's going to be a waste of time, and it's going to give them a chance to respond to your argument. Instead, you should be establishing the premises that you can use to get the conclusions later. But once again, don't just ask them if they agree with the conclusion. They'll never say yes. Additionally, you should ask relatively pointed and closed questions. What I mean by this is you shouldn't be asking questions like, oh, could you clarify this argument, or could you restate your second contention, or something like that. When you do that, you're letting your opponent, one, waste a whole lot of your cross-examination time, which means you're not going to be able to get to a lot of other things that you would want to. And second, you're letting your opponent re-explain their position to a judge. That's really bad, because if your judge was initially skeptical of that position, you're now letting your opponent have another opportunity to win them over. Don't let your opponent turn your cross-examination period into another 3-minute speech for them. Additionally, this also means that you have to be comfortable cutting off your opponent politely. Now, you can't just say, alright, thank you, moving on, like really snarky, because then that's going to make you look kind of like a bully or kind of a jerk, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. Instead, say, after you get the answer that you want, say thank you, and then try to move on. Let them talk a little bit, but don't let them talk a lot. But one thing I want to be clear, just because you're saying thank you doesn't mean you're not being rude. There's a big difference between letting your opponent talk for a second or two and then saying thank you and moving on with your next question, versus the instant your opponent says yes or no going thank you. Similarly, when you're being asked a question, because you want to elaborate as much as possible and waste your opponent's time, don't say irrelevant things, but don't begin with a yes because or a no because. Rather, state the reason why you're answering the question that way, and then state the conclusion, just so your opponent can't ask you a ton of questions in quick succession and get out something that might be really bad. Another tip that I have is to be really confident during cross-examination. In other words, be an authority on the topic, even if you're not. If your opponent asks you a really hard question that you're afraid could lose you the round, don't show to the judge that it's a really important question. Instead, no matter what your answer is, even if it's a bad answer it with confidence. That way it demonstrates to the judge that you believe what you're talking about and you have some sense of conviction, even if in reality you don't. Because it's all about persuading the judge, it's not about actually being correct. And finally, don't be too stubborn. Make sure you're always picking the battles, picking the things you disagree with. So we all agree that it's bad to let your opponent get out a really big concession during cross-examination. Now, some people's solution to this is they'll refuse to answer any question in a straightforward way. They'll just be really annoying, really catty, really stubborn. This almost always looks bad to the judge because it looks like you're trying to hide something. and it looks like you're afraid of the implications of your opponent's argument. Instead, answer something straightforward, but know what it is that you have to disagree with versus what you just have to say, yeah, that makes sense to. And the only way to really do this well is to research the topic well, so that you have a very good idea of what the essential arguments in the topic are, so you know where your opponent's trying to go with an argument. One thing that I really want to focus on this video is don't be a bully during cross-examination. And while this obviously applies for the entire round, you don't want to be a bully, in cross-examination it's particularly easy to come off as one. Now, there's a simple fact that if you're being a bully, if you're being mean, judges will dislike you, and they'll probably sympathize with your opponent. Now, some judges will consider being really mean a reason to give you a loss in the first place, and that'll be the end of it. However, other judges, even if they won't hold that position, once you establish yourself as being a bully, you've made yourself the villain in the round. Even if there's a chance they might vote for you, they'll probably sympathize with your opponent and kind of be rooting for them as the underdog, if that makes sense. But not being too aggressive is easier said than done, so we'll just talk about a few different things that you can do to avoid coming off as a bully. Similarly, you don't want to come off as spineless or afraid, so we'll also be talking about that as we go. First, always consider your body type. Consider the bad stereotypes that somebody might be able to generate just by looking at you. So if you're a really big, scary looking guy, you have to be particularly polite. For somebody that's very small, you can't be a pushover. Now there is a very fine line there of where you're looking confident versus when you're looking like a bully. But you nonetheless still have to walk that line. But a key component of this is considering your body type. If you're a really big guy, you're going to look like you're being a jerk if you're being aggressive. Next, make sure that you stay calm. Now this is something that can be a lot easier said than done. First, if your opponent says something that really doesn't make sense to you and you're just thinking, wow, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, don't get frustrated. Similarly, if your opponent's just trying to avoid all the questions that you're asking them and they're being very stubborn, make sure you're still maintaining your composure. If you lose your composure, it looks like you don't know how to handle your opponent. It will always make you look bad, no matter how stupid your opponent's being. Additionally, if you think you're just that much better than your opponent, and your opponent's even giving you certain concessions that are really important, don't get that taste of blood and get really aggressive. Getting really aggressive is never worth it. Once again, just like when your opponent's being frustrating, even when your opponent's giving you the things you want, make sure that you're staying very calm, very collected. Be a confident authority in the room, but don't be frustrated. The last thing that we're going to talk about is how to get better at cross-examination. So as I said at the beginning of this video, cross-ex is the kind of thing that just practicing it is essential to making you better. Experience always helps. So that means you should be practicing with your teammates whenever possible. But even though regular 3-minute cross-ex is still good practice, there are a few things that you can do to modify that cross-ex to make it even better in certain scenarios. The first drill I'd suggest is extended cross-ex, in which instead of going for 3 minutes, you either go for a longer period of time or you just go until you run out of questions without worrying how long you go. There are a few different benefits to extended cross-examination. If you're the person asking the questions, it helps you figure out what the best lines of questioning are for a topic. And the reason extended CX does this better than regular cross-ex is that rather than having to pick and choose which questions or line of questioning you'll pursue, you can pursue all of them just to see where the strengths and weaknesses of a certain position are. Additionally, this is a drill that's really helpful if you're the person being asked questions, because you have to defend pretty much an endless onslaught of questions without being saved by the bell. So this forces you to learn how to directly confront hard questions without dodging them, because if you dodge them, your opponent's just going to be able to ask again because there's no time limit. And finally, one really big benefit to extended cross-ex is I think it can be really helpful whenever you're using a new case, because you get to flesh out every problem that might exist within that case. The second drill that I'd suggest is the opposite of extended cross-examination, and that's just limited CX. Now with limited CX, rather than going for 3 minutes, you go for something like 1 minute. And this is a drill that's really helpful for the person asking the questions, because you have to learn how to cut off your opponent politely, given that you don't have time to let them elaborate unnecessarily. Additionally, it also trains you to keep moving in cross-examination. One thing that a lot of novices do in cross-ex is they might spend the entire cross-ex on one specific issue. While this can be good in certain scenarios, it usually isn't a good idea. And limited cross-ex trains you to learn how to move on once you've got what you need. So that's all we have for today. Thank you. This is Grant with Fight for Forensics.